Oh, they cleared a bunch
You
of
got it all in,
stuff
put it all together, and now it's working.
That's good. That's really good.
There's Mallory.
Mallory, do you still have the Wi-Fi? Do you still know the Wi-Fi?
Yeah.
Is this all lowercase?
Wow, you guys are.
Yes. Okay, A26 SHR 930.
I'm gonna have you tell me again, so I can have it in my phone. Is it the guest one? I'm assuming.
I did use
Hi,
it.
Sarah.
Maybe I should get it.
Tell me what it is.
A26 SHR 930.
There he is, bundled up.
Can you do it again?
I
Must
think
have seen someone
it's
else
trying.
drive
Oh,
by.
it's working.
I could have sworn I saw you drive by.
Yeah,
Like-
stop.
Yeah, you went. You and I was trying to get a ride, but then I was telling Byron, like, I could not get back into my driveway with no momentum.
Oh,
So
yeah.
I was like, I guess I'm have to.
I haven't left the house today, so I just realized my driveway's a little ice. The sun might do a little bit something to it.
I should have put ice melt down on it.
Hi,
after
Jonathan.
I left.
You want to
Trying to figure it out,
So
yeah.
I'll pull up Google Maps.
Okay.
Oh, okay. I know.
Well,
I
yeah,
don't live
we'll
here
definitely have to.
9, 10 years. I don't know.
Yeah.
Everywhere.
Well, we'll have to bring your laptop in.
Well, how's the world treating you?
All right. Cold, you know.
Oh.
Bone chilling cold.
Here,
but
oh,
other than
yeah.
that-
Come on, John, Tommy.
Hey, Corey, we got everybody.
Yeah.
It's a full house. Ice doesn't stop this crew.
That's right.
Just like what, like a half a mile of
Yeah.
flatness
Bit-
to navigate.
We made it through half a mile of partially sleet-covered streets about 12 hours ago, but by golly, we're here.
Oh, I don't have. Oh, I can.
I actually worked from home, so the most dressed up I've been all day. I had to actually like, get ready.
I wore these clothes.
Something's wrong.
One of my coworkers was like, "Is this a Star Trek sweater?" I was like,
thing, you got all the old guys over
I didn't think it was there,
Cozy casual
there
there.
was hardly anyone at my office.
Yeah,
I canceled
I
a
get kind of.
meeting and
That's right. That's right.
I'm not even gonna try to get in.
Well, we changed
Sitting all day.
They shuffle this around.
It's like
Ready?
the better block.
I call it gorilla
Sounds more hot.
full style.
I think we got full house here for the first time in a while, which is great. So
I do think it's the most effective.
go ahead and call this meeting to order, and I'll ask for a motion and a second to approve the agenda for this evening, February 7th, 2019.
So moved. Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed?
Aye.
Perfect. And then we'll move on to approve the minutes of our last meeting on December 6, 2018. I'll ask for a motion. and a
So
second.
moved. Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Great. Moving on. It is a new year, so I will ask for nominations for officers. It doesn't matter, we can start with either one, or I'll take nominations for chairperson.
I nominate Jonathan Barnes for chairperson.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Right, I'll take nominations for secretary. Don't all line up at once.
Well, actually, yeah. I'll nominate Laura again.
Yeah, I'll do it again.
I'll second. All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Great, humming right along here. Let's see. I'll ask for a, do I need to make it in the next motion to do this over again? You have another line that once nominations have been made, ask, okay, we did that, never mind. Got it, thanks, sorry. All right, moving on to the first order of business tonight, design review for 1850 Burlington. Call on Sarah Copeland for procedure.
You might feel like you've already discussed this because we did discuss the conditional use permit for this at your last meeting. So this review really satisfies one of the conditions of that approval, which was that the final site plan shall be submitted to the Planning Commission for approval pursuant to the requirements of this zoning district, C2, or downtown business zoning district. The staff report that's before you reviews the conditions of that conditional use permit approval. This is not a public hearing, but it does require your review and approval. So we did go through those 7 conditions. The site plan does show the removal of the unused concrete aprons on Burlington and Buchanan and restoring the sidewalk. The second was that signage shall comply with the sign regulations. They are showing some signs on the site plan here, and they are out of the right-of-way. Sign permits go through their own application process because we issue permits for those separately. So there's not a lot of detail about that in your packet, but that's what they're showing is appropriate for the site plan. Number 3 is that landscaping beds shall include appropriate vegetation, and there is a landscaping plan included. They are making heavy use of evergreens, which we think is appropriate for this use. Number 4 is the site plan has been submitted to you. 5, 6, and 7 are really our standard conditions for conditional use permits, so not a whole lot to say here. We may, as we finish the site plan review with staff before issuing a building permit, find some things that need to be adjusted, but at this point, we don't know of any, and the other 2 are pretty standard, 6 and 7. So we are recommending approval of this to you tonight, subject to 3 conditions. Landscaping shall be kept in a healthy and attractive state. That's a requirement of the ordinance anyway, but we like to be specific. 2 is that the sign shall be permitted prior to installation, which they should do anyway, but we have had in the past somebody who just put up the signs without a permit, so we like to be specific. And number 3, again, is about the final site plan. If anything needs to be adjusted, that they will comply with requests from staff. I'd be happy to answer any questions. The applicant is here again. If you have any further questions about this development, that's all I have.
All right. I thought of a couple. It was after we left last time. I didn't get to ask, so this might be a appropriate time to ask. And I see that there's a, in the plan, there's a payment kiosk. So is this going to be where you can use your, is it going to be like one of those, digital ones? You put in your number and that's you park. Are you paying per set number of hours? What's the rate of the parking going to cost? That kind of stuff. Just
Okay, so you can do various kiosks. What we're choosing to do is a kiosk that works with a credit card or an application with a via a smartphone, smart device. Rates we're trying to figure out. We're pretty much thinking that in the early hours it might be like $2 an hour, but there'll be like caps, like maximum caps, and then in the evenings it might go up to about $3 an hour. But again, it'll be caps, like after let's say 3 or 4 hours, it just maxes out at a certain point. That's that. There is no contingent, or we're not going to have it take cash because taking cash, it's hard on the machines, and it also becomes a target for theft, for both the machine and then anyone that has to go pick up the cash.
and then what's this might be a related question. Do we have any other paid lots in the city currently?
Not that I know of.
Okay. And I just didn't know if we had any guidelines on what maximum rates can be, or if that falls in the
No.
planning commission's
No,
area.
no. We don't set rates for anything that's bought or sold in the city that we don't buy or sell ourselves.
Are you done? I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
You sure?
Well, just in regard, what's going to be your enforcement? Is there just going to be like a, if someone's past their time, there's someone that comes around, or you have towing, or what do you think will be the enforcement policy for?
Well, well, it's sort of, I guess, tiered, right? So first you're doing a spot check. So you imagine that you have your phone, right? You can put on an application where you can read plates. And the plates will either list as something that's in compliance or not compliance. So let's say, just for argument's sake, you come to the lot, you don't pay. You're not going to even be on the list of what's in compliance or non-compliance. You're just not going to be on the list. So what you could do is initially give the person a ticket, right? And the fine could be like 10, 20 bucks, whatever. If you get somebody that's a repeat, I guess, offender, where they keep coming onto your property, they keep not paying, then you could, if you wanted to, you could tow. I mean, in a sense, you've got a lot of latitude of, you could just tow on the first offense, but you're trying not to have a bad rapport with your community. So it's not really great to be like, oh, you're 1 minute over,
Yeah.
bam. But really what would happen is, let's say you come there and you enter your plate number, and then you pay for, let's say, 2 hours. and you'll have an option of putting in your phone number. So you would get, like, let's say a text message saying you got 15 minutes left, would you like to re-up or whatever, and then you kind of decide, yay, nay, and it works pretty well as far as we can tell, but.
And I imagine this would be a private company you'd be contracting with to monitor.
Eventually, yeah. I mean, initially we're going to do it ourselves just to sort of see how it's going and adjust. Because it's like if you hire a company to do it, they'll do what you tell them to do, but they may not adjust. Whereas you can say, oh, this is working or this is not working. I better, shift this. I got to shift the rates. I've got to shift this enforcement.
One concern that I have with a machine that doesn't take cash is that not everyone has a credit card. It's a concern of mine, and like my other professional work that I do, we're always trying to make sure we're not making it so that something is inaccessible to people. So it's a concern to me that, you all know that, like, I'm not super enthused about this parking lot to begin with.
I'm very clear on that.
Yeah,
Yes.
so now it's making me even less enthused because it basically is an equity issue, or most people who, can afford one have a credit card, but those who can't don't, and basically they won't be able to park on your lot,
Well,
right?
I would put it like this. There are options that are available, and they are workable. Now, if you want to add every option under the sun and you want to personally collect and you personally want to get shot at, you are
What?
more than welcome to it.
What are you talking about? Shot
Listen,
at?
Listen, what I'm telling you is when you have a cash machine, you've got problems. You have problems with the machine having dollars going in, money coming out, so that's wear and tear. You've got problems with theft. You've got problems with the people you have possibly stealing from it. You've got problems with people who want it because it's sitting there, so you can have people vandalize the machines. Now you have problems with people when they go to collect. Sorry, go ahead.
Here's what I think. I think if you don't have a credit card, you park somewhere else. That's the answer. It's as simple as that. So you go up there and it takes a credit card. It's like, oops, I don't have one. Do you have one, Joe? I do. I'll pay. Or nobody's got a credit card. We'll go walk from NT Realty's lot.
But would the signage say just to prevent confusion, if I pull into the lot, is it going to say you must have a credit card to park here, just so you know, or?
Yeah, the sign would say your payment option, so it would say credit card or various apps. Let's say you had PayPal or whatever. I mean, just something, so you can just look at it and go, oh, I can do this, I can do this, I can do this. I can't do this other option I want. I mean, let's say you have a machine that takes cash, but somebody shows up with pocket change. It's like you can get into these what ifs, how far can we go out where somebody's going to be not able to do exactly what they want.
It's not an issue of just not being able to do what you want. It's an issue of people not having the finances to have a credit card and therefore not being able to park there. I understand that obviously they can park down the street. That was my whole argument last time when you came before this body, was that people would walk. And I personally am going to find it really interesting to see if people are going to walk or pay money in the only paid parking lot in North Kansas City. It's going to be interesting to me. I don't know the answer to that question.
Well, I think the answer is they're taking the risk with their money to build it, and they're going to find out.
Right.
And I think the business owners in the direct immediate area of that, they want it. That's going to do something good for their business. And we're having a problem in North Kansas City right now with a lot of theft. I mean, we had a building, the copper was stripped out of the box last night, put a tenant out for 24 hours. So you don't want an attractive nuisance down there with cash. I just don't think that's the answer. And if you don't have cash, you park somewhere else. It's simple as that.
My other question was, I guess that covers it, the no paid lot thing. Yeah, I mean, I categorically disagree that it's as simple as that. It is not as simple as that, in my perspective. But Yeah, I mean, it's not, I don't believe it's illegal what you're doing, but I don't think that it is quote unquote the right thing to do. I think that giving everyone in the city the option to park would be sort of the best option. But that's all I have to say about it.
Well, I mean, I think it's one of those things where there are lots of things that would be wonderful if we can do them. However, there are
I mean,
also,
you could do it.
there's an opportunity, there's a cost to doing it, though. And the
Right.
cost is personal risk, okay? And when I asked you, have you ever been shot at, it was not a flip question. It really does inform your perspective.
Have you
I
ever been
have,
shot at?
Yes.
Collecting cash from a machine.
No, at a family business where we were robbed and one of our workers died. So, you know, when you ask me this, it is a personal thing. I do not like taking those kinds of risks when they're not necessary. Now, I understand you're like, well, you know, it's pie in the sky, it may not happen again. But, you know, when you're dealing with cash, people do stupid things. I mean, people will, when I was living in Baltimore, somebody shot somebody over $5. $5. It was nothing, but they did it.
You know, from the fact that last meeting, it was stated that the parking lot looks like it's from Afghanistan, to you bringing up the shooting comment, it really, to me, is like a dramatization of the situation.
Oh my God, those things are totally separate. What somebody was saying when they said it looks like Afghanistan was they were saying
I know
it
they're
was
separate,
stark.
they were both dramatic.
It was stark in the sense it was just concrete.
I wasn't trying to draw a connection.
You were
actually.
absolutely drawing
No,
a connection.
I was trying to say that both of those comments were very dramatic. That's what I was trying to say.
I think it's probably best to move on.
Yeah,
Any more questions?
nothing. I don't think we need to talk about it anymore.
I'd like to make a motion. I move that the Planning Commission approve the design review for 1815 Burlington, subject to the following conditions. They've already been said.
Well, Tom, one second, just make sure anybody else has any more questions. No? Okay. I will second.
I'll second.
All approved? Or all in
Aye.
favor? Aye. All opposed? Laura?
No, I'm not opposed.
Oh, you're not opposed? Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you.
Get busy.
Moving on to a design review for 2004 Swift and NB Properties LLC PC 2019-02. Mallory, you're up for procedure.
All right, so this is going to be the same procedure as the application that you just heard. It is design review, again, for the C2 zoning district, which is required in that zoning district. In this case, however, the applicant is proposing to construct an addition to the rear portion of an existing building and make some exterior changes. The applicant did plan to be present tonight, but was coming all the way from Iowa and ran into some weather-related issues. So I did speak with them today a little bit more about the application, so I'll answer any questions after I get done. If you'd like me to proceed with the criteria for review.
The applicant is not here, so please do.
All righty. So this application, it was a little bit hard for staff to judge because it just doesn't even come close to complying with a lot of what's required in the ordinance, because they are constructing something to the rear portion of their building which is not visible from any street, and it is a rather small addition to the building. However, the materials that they do propose to use are compatible with the existing building and then also the surrounding buildings. They are also proposing some changes to the exterior of the building. So if you're not familiar with it, this is the area that Christine's Firehouse used to be located in. And so that would be on 20th. And then the current location of Dr. Bush's dental office, which is North Kansas City Dental. And then I believe he also has a sleep center there as well. So this development would allow him to connect all of those buildings on the inside and expand his dental practice. So as part of that, he would remove some of the entryways, particularly the entryway that used to go into Christine's Firehouse, and he would replace that with a glass storefront. And then over the existing entryway, he would install their glass cantilevered awnings, I guess I'd call them, that do have an LED lighting on them. And so staff determines that that is all compatible with the ordinance and what's currently exists there. Let's see. The building actually is already 3 stories. There is residential above it, so there's no concern there. The addition that they're proposing, however, is 1 story. So staff would recommend approval of this application with 1 suggested condition that the applicant comply with all amendments or revisions requested by staff to comply with the adopted building codes, fire codes, utility requirements, and site plan requirements. There are a few concerns when it comes to construction-related codes for this addition, which we have already discussed with the applicant, and they are willing to comply with what would be required of them. So this proposed site plan might change a little bit as we go through that review process with them. Do you have any questions?
Any questions?
Has our planning people have looked at the drawings and everything and think that it's all okay, it's not gonna fall down or something like that?
Oh, no. Well, we haven't seen complete construction documents yet, but the applicant is actually their architect who I've been working with, and so the existing structure is a sound structure, and then the proposed new addition would also comply with the codes, yeah.
You know, this might be a good time. You know, I've always thought that anybody on the planning commission should go out and take a look at what they're, you know, physically look at it to see what what's planned. I'll be honest with you, I just found out about this yesterday. I would have liked to known about it earlier, so I could have had some time to go down there and take a look. I don't know whether this could happen, but I highly recommend that maybe in the future we get a little bit more time to look at things before we just have to come in here and vote on them. That's all I got.
Any more questions or comments? I guess we'll move on to a motion.
Are you going to make a motion on this?
Yeah, I was just
okay.
asking for a motion on this. So if you'd like to make a motion, you can go ahead.
Okay. Okay. I move the Planning Commission approve the design review of this proposed development for 2004 Swift, subject to the following conditions, which are stated.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Great. Thanks, Mallory. Okay, moving on to the zoning ordinance update.
While Chris is sitting down, I'll just give you a brief overview, and he's got the more in-depth overview for you. We are moving right along in this process, and we actually had a discussion this afternoon that we'll get into further about the schedule for wrapping this project up. So, which is a little nerve-wracking, but also kind of exciting that we're almost there. So, you all had in your packet the almost ready for prime time draft, and we really would encourage you to read through that. I know that it's very exciting in every respect, but we're really anxious to get your feedback as we start to finalize portions of this. So I really want to underline how important it is to hear your comments and your questions and random thoughts. Any feedback you have for us at this point is very valuable. And I'll let Chris take it from here, but I just want to underline, please feel free to interrupt at any point if you have questions or concerns that you would like to raise.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm going to, since we've met several times on this, but I wanted to take a step back and go through the bigger picture to remind us of all, one, the overall scope and how we got to this point. So this is what we laid out and some of our key benchmarks throughout the process. And just to get a sense of where we're at, as Sarah mentioned, you've got the full initial draft for the first time. a couple prefaces of that of we know there's still things that we need to change and work through, and so you know, there's going to be formatting things that we haven't quite gotten to yet that we're still testing. So we're looking, we're working on those. So don't, you know, if you point those out, great. But if you're looking through it as a proofreading one, we'll do that at final draft. What we're really looking for are, is there anything in here that just isn't going to work? Are we headed the wrong direction? Or things that we need to tweak based on your observations of your community and projects you've been involved with or projects you remember. So here we are we've got the initial draft in its most complete state. And if you'll notice on the schedule, we're a little bit behind of where we mapped out about a year ago. But as Sarah said, I think we're well within getting this adopted by April or May based on how we move forward. And I'll point that out at the end here on our next steps. Where we've been, so a little over a year ago, we had a kickoff meeting where we just discussed with you all what are the overall goals for this project, general thoughts on the master plan that you recently adopted. From there, we jumped into our summary, the plan conformance report. We went back to that frequently in our drafting to make sure we were making the appropriate links to the plan, things that were observed in that report where your ordinance wasn't meeting the plan and what types of changes we wanted to make. We were before the council in April to present some of that and get their feedback on the direction of the project as well. And then that set us up for the next 6 months or so where we worked on the initial draft. We came to you first with the framework, in other words, how we're going to reorganize the new ordinance and fit your current standards that are working in. From there, we went to our citywide strategies, the things that were going to be the overall structure of the ordinance. And then the last component that we were working on was that idea of the form-based codes and Burlington corridor idea, how the urban areas is what we were calling it would work and mix in with the code. So tonight is the night where we kind of see it all trying to come together. So master plan themes for, you know, just to refresh our memory, and by the way, if you stop me at any point if you have any questions, this is kind of the history part I'm going to go through real quick just to lay the groundwork, but please stop me at any point. These are the 5 main things of your master plan. Not all of them are always going to be regulated into existence, but a lot of these things do impact the regulations. So at any point when we're not really accomplishing these types of things, we need to be questioning, you know, do the regulations need to be adjusted to do this better, or is this an area where the regulations don't really impact that goal that much? But we just always want to be cognizant of these major themes because they're very strong throughout the master plan. The other element of your master plan that we relied on, as you'll see in a minute, is the character areas that were this part of this framework map from the master plan. So areas of distinct scale, form, character that don't necessarily reflect the zoning district boundaries 100%. So what does that mean to the development regulations was always something that was in our thoughts. So overall, the plan conformance report had organized what we needed to work on under these main themes. First of all, just organization and simplification, making the code as user-friendly as we can, getting rid of legalese, incorporating graphics and tables wherever we can, and we're partway into that exercise. Getting more flexibility where we can. Regulations don't always have to be black and white. They can be flexible as long as they're guided by criteria, so we've got a lot of that in this code as well. And then again, towing that balance of can staff make good decisions, or are we putting them in difficult spots sometimes? We don't want to have them always be making difficult decisions or coming to you all for things, so we want them to be as clear as we can, but also give flexibility where it's appropriate. Housing options was a key theme from the plan, and so we discussed with you all quite a bit of the idea of switching to a building type strategy, so we're not just measuring density when we talk about residential development. Places, the plan talks a lot about the distinct places in your community, and the standards didn't really reflect that. They were more a one-size-fits-all. So when we started to talk about design and character, it was more about how do projects relate to the public realm, the streetscapes and open spaces that shape that different area. They're very different in different contexts of the community. So that was going to be our cue for how we regulate design and the character of places. The scale of uses are being important, not just the land use, and then focusing on frontage types and street types for our queues. And then the last one, parking, getting better parking strategies, mainly flexibility, opportunity to reduce parking, and then and options to do that, and then regulating the design of how the parking lots impact and interface with the area around it. The framework we came out back in the left side of this screen is your current standards. Like most communities, it's simply a collection of standards. That's not an integrated product trying to accomplish a physical planning goal. That's not that unusual, and especially not that unusual when you amend your ordinance over time. So when we took a step back to relook at it, we suggested organizing it as you see on the right. So far fewer chapters. Part of that is because we were able to eliminate some redundancy. Part of that was because we found sections that we thought we didn't need. And then part of that was just some of those sections organize a bunch of different topics that are related to that overall title. So that gets us up to where we're at now. And so I'm going to begin to walk through each of these sections and kind of hit the major changes or different approaches or things you may want to look at as you review this draft. The general provisions, it's a chapter you have now, but what we did there is we took everything that related to the overall legal prerequisites and structure of the code and grouped everything in there. So a few things got moved. One was moving the nonconformances section in there. Other than that, we mainly did a kind of a simplification of language. We tried to make things more plain spoken. And then we did go into the purposes section and more directly tie them to some of the goals of your master plan. The current purposes section is simply regurgitating the statutory purposes of zoning that all cities can use. And so we thought it was appropriate to really start putting in some of the policy goals in your master plan to say that was the purpose of North Kansas City's zoning ordinance rather than just rely on the statutory authority. So nothing that substantive there, just mainly setting the tone and kind of the things that will hopefully make the code work better, or a lot of these things are things you don't really view when you're implementing it day to day, but they're necessary as well. The second chapter is the procedures. You have a procedure section, 1796, that has most of your procedures, but there was evidence of places where procedures leaked into other sections, and so we did a consolidation of them all there. The biggest change was we took anything that was either common to all procedures or that a certain application procedure, more than one procedure used that. We put it in the first section, which is that 1708-010 common for all applications. The reason we did that is we can just say it there and then use that procedures table to rely on when you have to do that and don't, and then you don't have to repeat it each time we come into it. Things like notice provisions were commonly repeated over and over again because they're applicable to all applications, but we thought it was better to put them here and not say it each time because it allowed us to shrink the procedure section a lot. Application criteria. One thing we did remove from here is the current ordinance has lots of things of what it takes to turn in an application, application requirements. And in discussing that with staff, we took them out of the ordinance and merely have a section that delegates the director to establish forms and application criteria. One of the reasons for that is it makes the ordinance a little bit more user-friendly. Those sections are really long and really technical. And a lot of times they have things that may not be applicable to each application, even the scale of drawings and things like that. And then the other thing is if you ever find the need to change, technically because it's in your ordinance, you have to have a public hearing because you're changing your ordinance. And so our thought was if we delegate that to the director can make forms and decide what's needed for each particular application. And then those forms can just be updated periodically and it's not an ordinance change. So just a little bit of a user-friendly behind-the-scenes strategy there. Yes.
At one time, I think it was discussed that possibly changing some of this to where normally you'd have to have a zoning change to where you might go to just a conditional use permit. Is that addressed anywhere in this new thing, or?
in terms of a procedure. We're not really changing the procedure for a rezoning or for a conditional use permit. I don't know that we have a lot of latitude to do that. But we have, when Chris gets into the sections on resident uses and the residential design standards, we are proposing that we have more flexibility for mixed uses, which would require a conditional use.
Okay, I'm just ahead of myself.
You're just a little bit ahead of us, I think, on that.
I'm sorry.
Other than that, each of the specific procedures for different types of applications, conditional use versus rezoning versus variance, they're just much more streamlined into the subheadings that are there, applicability review criteria, any specific procedures for the application, and then what's the effect of the decision. So a little bit more user-friendly, giving applicants a heads up of how the decision is going to be made, hopefully giving decision makers a little bit more framework for how they should be viewing different applications. The biggest substantive change here was we did take a new approach to plan zoning, and it's one we've discussed with you all before when we were first looking at this under the framework. But removing your current PUD section, the PUD is for when your code isn't working correctly, and we want innovative things that our code doesn't anticipate, so let's just call it a PUD, and it's its own zoning category, and whatever someone turns in, that becomes a PUD. So our thought was, since we're taking the time to get the zoning districts working better for your plan, there's certainly going to be the need for some flexibility based on something different we didn't anticipate, but at least it could be based on those zoning districts, and that what we're really talking about is a master plan development process that uses bits and pieces of all of those zoning districts, and then they come in and ask for things when they need flexibility from. So that's just a recharacterization of your PUD. If you're thumbing through this and you say, I don't see our PUD section, that's because it's all in that procedure section called master plan development. So what we're doing is we're relying on all of the base zoning districts, but we're allowing someone through that process to ask for different sets of standards or deviations from those standards based on their particular master plan. Now into some of the more, I guess, exciting changes, or at least substantive changes. 1712, zoning districts and uses. So what we did here was we wanted to separate everything that was a use-related regulation, in other words, land uses, separate that from what we would consider physical planning, design, or development standards. So 1712 has everything to do with uses and very little to do with the development. So we what that enabled us to do is not to have each zoning district as its own chapter. So everything related to land uses is in here. There's a use table, which you haven't had before. What we did was we took each zoning district now has a long list of different uses, and that's a little bit problematic. One, because they're at times too specific, and there's also times when they also conflict with other districts, because it's called one thing in one district and something else in the other, and they're not necessarily an apples to apples comparison. So we did base this table off of all of your current lists of uses. So our intent is not to have any substantive changes unless we were alerted to the need for any of those. So that table that's in there came from that as its start. From there, we did generalize some of the uses. In other words, if we had a collection of things that were called something different throughout the different categories, rather than have a long list of that, we just condensed them into a more general use. And then we did, at some places, make distinctions based on the scale of uses. And when I flip to the next slide, I'll give an example of that. The reason we did that was because, again, as I mentioned, the uses oftentimes aren't a good distinguisher of where you want something and why. What's really a better distinguisher is what's the scale of it and what's the impact it might have on its surrounding property. So with some of the other standards that we'll talk about later, there was an opportunity to both generalize some of the uses but also make some distinctions based on the scale of the use. The last thing was some of the non-residential districts have what are called performance standards, and those are the types of standards that are intended to limit potential impacts that we anticipate on adjacent property. And so one of our thoughts in that last section is, why don't we list all of the performance standards? It's that 17.12.050. It's just a simple table that deals with things like outdoor storage, noise, lighting, and if we can base it off some of the current performance standards in your existing ordinance, broaden that a little bit so that each of the districts are really regulating performance more so than they are use. So it can allow us to be a lot more flexible and open to different land uses as well. So in association with all of those, the biggest changes to the zoning districts from your current standards are repurposing the R4 district, which is currently like for large-scale apartments, but repositioning that one as mixed-density residential. It's not mapped very extensively on your zoning map, so that was one of the reasons we picked that zoning district to be the one for change, and then that would tie to your meeting your housing options strategy of your master plan. We're suggesting that we convert what's the CO district to the CIO district, and the subtle change there is it's currently non-retail business, so that O is office, and it's clear that it was intended for small neighborhood scale or things that would be compatible for neighborhoods, but really all it's used for, except for a few spots on the zoning map north of downtown, all it's used for is the hospital campus. So it's really a large campus institutional district, and so we were suggesting, since that's the way the map reads, why don't we just convert that district to those standards, and then we'll worry about the other areas where CO is zoned later, because they're more appropriate for other districts. So a complete repurposing of that zoning district, more in line with how it's used right now. In the C1 through 3 districts, they were all very similar, both in terms of their development standards and in the uses they allowed. And what was clear from the original intent statements of those districts is that there was supposed to be a neighborhood scale, a downtown scale, and then a general retail business. So getting those back in line with those purposes. And then the last one is we do see an opportunity to discontinue the PC district. It's public civic, I believe is what it stands for. It's not mapped, and because we were integrating some of those uses into other zoning districts, we didn't necessarily see a need for it going forward. So it may be something that we're able to drop out either at final draft or adoption draft. This is just an excerpt of the use table. To the mayor's question, what it enables us to do is do a better comparison of where some things may not require a rezoning, and we just want to mark it as a C and put it as a conditional use in some districts. The other thing it does reflect is, if you look at the retail uses as an example, instead of calling something a shoe store versus a hardware store or whatever type of retail it is, we just called it all retail, but then distinguished it based on the scale of the use, so the square footage there, and then you can see them being abled in descending order based on how intense the district is, or whether it's really intended for a different purpose, such as the industrial districts. You see retail kind of fading out of that one as well.
And coming back to your question, I would point out, you can see it in this table here, one of the things we discussed in our repurposing of the R4 district is that in both larger scale, multifamily developments, and like think One North and the apartments there, or smaller scale multifamily developments like 18th and Swift, there might be an interest in having some kind of small scale retail or restaurant use that's an amenity to the development, but also potentially to the larger neighborhood, and that would be a good conditional use to allow in that zoning district, which we don't allow right now. So you can see here we're showing both retail limited and restaurant limited as a conditional use in the R4 and R5 zoning districts. So we've been trying to think about that district working at both a larger scale and a smaller scale and being very flexible. But being flexible in a way where we're being clear what is permitted without any review and what we think would need to come before you and the city council for review and approval, because it might be, we want to make sure that it fits into the character of the area and is not something that the neighborhood wouldn't be comfortable with.
Thank you.
What was your thought on the medical marijuana dispensary I noticed that it's one of only a few things that is only permitted in one zone. And I was wondering if you did research on that, or how did you come about that?
We have lots of thoughts about medical marijuana. And to be honest, we're going to talk a lot more about medical marijuana at your March meeting, because we're going to propose making some amendments to the existing ordinance to get them adopted and on, codified now, and that then they get wrapped into this ordinance. So just to give you the high points really fast. We did have a memo about this in council's work session agenda this past Tuesday, if you want to read more about what's coming. There are 4 types of medical marijuana businesses that were listed in Amendment 2. Dispensaries, cultivation, infused products manufacturing, and testing. What we're going to propose is that we include dispensaries as a permitted use in the C3 district, and cultivation, product manufacturing, and testing as permitted uses in M1 and M2, subject to a 300-foot buffer requirement from churches, schools, and daycares, which would be less than what's in the Amendment 2. 1,000 square feet, or 1,000 feet is the maximum. We're proposing reducing that to 300 feet. And then with some additional standards for the use about hours of operation and consumption and prohibiting outdoor storage, et cetera. So you'll see a lot more about that in March.
Okay.
So
just one quick reflection on it, like it, I can't quite remember when, is it going to be legal a particular month this year, or is it already legal for, can't recall.
No, they are taking applications for permits, but no permits have been issued yet. And I think the soonest that the state would be issuing permits is December.
Okay.
Wow. It's later this year, but we're nervous about waiting too long to put something into the ordinance.
Yeah, I was just thinking, it's a permitted medical use. I don't know why you wouldn't permit it in one of the lower commercial districts. That was my first reaction. It's a medical use. People got.
Well, even if we did, actually, most of our C2 district would be included in a 300-foot buffer. So, and we've got a lot of churches, schools, and daycares that are really close together. That really takes up a lot of like the north part of downtown, and part of Burlington corridor. So even if you wanted to allow it in C1 or C2, you probably don't find a building that's outside of that buffer area. And the police chief has a lot of concerns about security. So we think we're better off starting with those 3 zoning districts. And as I said to council on Tuesday night, what we're proposing is not necessarily the be-all and end-all of medical marijuana regulation for North Kansas City. It's a starting point that then we can adjust as we learn more and as we get answers from the state. We still don't know much about what they're doing, and so we still have a lot of question marks. This is just, let's establish where it's permitted so that people have a framework as they are starting to make investments in property.
Yeah, I would think then maybe a conditional use option in one of those other districts might be, that way if there was a particular property that, say, a business owner was interested in and it happened to not be in the 300-foot buffer, then there'd be the opportunity for review.
I've actually heard a lot of recommendations against doing that because of legal concerns about the record that gets built as part of the public hearing process. And our perspective is, absent some other problem, we'll just establish where it's okay, where and how it is okay to operate that business, so that we don't have to put people through that process.
The one thing I might say is things are changing so fast now. We're facing things that we never heard of before, and we're trying to catch up to make some way to make it a reasonable place to live, and there's a lot of things that are so brand new. Who would have heard of a paid parking lot, 2 years ago? Things are coming. So we're going to have to work with it.
That's a good segue into the bigger picture of this table. We if you've gone through your draft, you might be looking for, well, on this table, I don't know exactly what you're talking about when you say this use. Right now, we don't have the descriptions of these uses in there. We have a working draft of that we're going through with staff. So if you're having any trouble with that, just let us know and we'll get you a copy of that. But each of these uses will come with a description that says what this use intends. And that's where we put some of the examples of the uses, some of the things from your current ordinance that are the kind of long laundry list. We use that to give a description of these generalized uses. As noted, some of them are specific for a reason, such as the medical marijuana. It could fit in any of those retail categories based on the size, but it was pulled out because of some specific issues with that particular use. So that kind of theme runs through the use table. But overall, it's a more general approach. And then at the very head of our use descriptions, where we're going to describe each of these, there's a statement for new things that come along, things we didn't anticipate. They can fit into some of these general categories under the director's interpretation as long we put some criteria in there. If it's a similar building format and scale, if the operational aspects of the use in terms of traffic, customer, hours of operation, delivery are the same or similar to a use listed in here, the director can go ahead and make the interpretation that that's the same use we've accounted for and it fits into one of these categories. So the idea is it should be a little more flexible to as new things come along as well. So keep that in mind as you review and look for things that might be a concern to you. Okay, getting out of the zoning district and use standards, we grouped the development standards into two different sets of standards. This may be a little bit different from our original framework we showed you. So the first one is Chapter 1716. It's the residential development standards. As I mentioned, we shift from just a pure density-based requirement to a more building type approach. The reason for that was that we wanted to get more of the smaller scale but multi-unit building types enabled. So what we recognize in your current code is if you wanted to do a small or medium-sized apartment, something that might be on a small lot but have anywhere from 6 to 20 units in it, the density was quite high and it was forcing you to the R5 district and maybe not even that. So some of those building types were kind of getting whittled out when they really were smaller and neighborhood scale. So again, that's the repurposing of that R4 zoning district. And from there, all of the other standards, existing standards from your current residential district seem to fall into place, and I'll walk through that in a minute here. Associated with that, to get all those building types to fit in, it was important to look more at some of the neighborhood design standards. So there's a 1716 030 is what has all of the neighborhood design standards. It'll apply to, this is where we use the master plan frameworks specifically, the traditional neighborhood area that's mapped in your master plan, and then what we call the urban areas, any mixed use or residential projects that are occurring in and around the downtown area would be subject to these design standards. They're based primarily on the frontage. In other words, how is the front of the lot designed in the building and how does it relate to the streetscape? So I'll walk through those real quickly. Here are the types of buildings that the building type approach would enable more easily that aren't easily enabled under your current code unless you went through a PUD, as two of those pictured did. But basically a better filtering of the detached house lots and then the duplexes. But then the big one is the enabling the row home, small apartment, and medium apartment more specifically. And then again, as we talked about earlier, the opportunity to mix in some smaller scale mixed use buildings or a live work type building as well. So the way those shake out, this is the building type table that's in there for all residential districts, and everything highlighted in red here is based off your current standards. So in other words, the detached house neighborhood lot, those basically reflect your R1A development standards. And so that's enabled in all of the zoning districts. The detached house compact lot, that reflects your current R1B standards, and so that's enabled in R1B and up. And then the duplex multi-unit house basically reflects your current R2 standards, so it's enabled in R2 and up. So far we're kind of keeping the status quo of what's allowed and mapped now. And then shifting down to the large apartment and garden apartment primarily, those reflect the R3 and the R5 standards, and that's why those are each checked as allowed in that district. What that leaves is all those middle types which we're introducing as new, and then as you can see from this table, they're primarily enabled in the R4 and also R5 district, but the R4 district is where we're targeting for that new opportunity. And again, it will most likely will have to be mapped going forward. There are some small instances of it. In fact, one of the ones we studied over off, I think it's off of Swift, actually reflected this pattern. Probably wouldn't have been allowed under the current standards of R4, but with this, it would be either the small or medium apartment building. I guess another aspect of this table I should mention are the things we call the limited building types, the things that are in the open square. And so those location criteria that are listed below it are supposed to guide where that building type should be allowed, but otherwise, if it met all the standards, it could be allowed subject to those specific location criteria. So the neighborhood design standards, as I mentioned before, the right of the slide shows where it would be applicable. So those are the character areas mapped in your master plan. So any of these residential projects occurring in this area would be subject to these standards. They're based on five key elements: frontage types, front entry features, building scale and design, open and civic spaces, and then an option that we're calling the courtyard pattern. And I'll walk through each of those real quick as well. So frontage types, what we observed was you really have two types in these walkable urban areas, either a terrace type, where the building's really close to the lot line, or what we call the neighborhood yard, so anything that's anywhere from the 20 to 40 feet back range. And then the standards for where you place your garage, driveway, and access is based on which of those types you're using. If you're thinking in terms of older areas, it's the avenues versus the neighborhoods back behind downtown or north of downtown. Or if you're thinking of newer development, it's the North Gate patio homes versus the North Gate larger single-family homes between terrace and neighborhood yard frontages. But again, the standard here to reflect the more dense development and the more walkable pattern is really focused on where you're placing the garage and driveway and the extent of that in relation to the streetscape. The second standard deals with the front entry features, mainly specifying some design parameters, but also noting that this is an encroachment into those front backs. So before we were talking about where the building could be placed, well, this is now something that we're allowing to go even further towards the street to get that greater pedestrian scale. So the standards in there are mainly derived at creating that, but then also using that entry feature to drive some of the variety. So there's many different options you can do to put these on the building. I think that a good example of this is the row homes in Northgate. I remember way back when that was first proposed, one of the concepts, it was starting to look very kind of cookie cutter-ish, and well, someone went in and just said, well, let's make subtle changes to these door features. So if you notice them, they all have little subtle changes on them, and it kind of varies it a little bit. And so that concept expanded on a block scale could really add a lot of uniqueness and diversity. So that's the two purposes for that front entry feature requirement. One, to emphasize the pedestrian human scale, but then two, to add a lot of different options for the buildings so that they can really become diverse over time. And again, the lower image kind of reflects that this is also a feature used to blend lots of building types of a different scale as you move along the block, so things that could happen in some of these areas that would transition from that neighborhood yard frontage to a terrace frontage and then to a more urban frontage as well. The third major standard is building scale and designs. Mainly applying only to multifamily and the non-residential buildings that are allowed in these districts. And these are just things to break down the massing of larger buildings. So varying the wall planes, adding projections and things that stick out, windows, doors, and balconies, things that break up that bit larger wall to make it relate to the pedestrian scale a little easier. And then the last two deal with open civic spaces and kind of that extension of the public realm that can really let you start to work in a lot of different building formats. So we were very clear on kind of making a distinction between open space at the larger scale. You know, if you have access to some of these spaces, and there shouldn't necessarily be an open space requirement. So a good example of that is, you know, the buildings next to Mackin Park or building around there. Again, not that you have a lot of opportunities to plat and build these spaces, but we simply wanted to account for that at the larger scale. But then what that does is at the site scale, it lets you have experiment with these different patterns. So the courtyard pattern section is an example of that. In exchange for arranging your lots or buildings around some of these spaces, in a sense what you're doing is you're overlaying that frontage requirement onto one spot for each of those building types. So it's a particularly effective strategy on deeper blocks, of which you have a lot of. And so you could be able to assemble 2 or 3 narrow lots that are deeper and implement this type of pattern. So those standards are kind of tailored towards that to give options as well. And again, a lot of this you're all pretty familiar with, because it's essentially a lot of the patterns that went into Northgate. It's a lot of the patterns that are reflective in some of your older neighborhoods. So we think we have those calibrated about right, but we're certainly want as many eyes on these strategies as possible going forward. The next one has to do with the non-residential development standards. The big thing here is, you know, following a similar theme, we were able to consolidate all of the development standards into one table. This was probably I guess this would be the most user-friendly part of the code, I think, that we have here, because currently, if you haven't noticed, you have each of your zoning districts on the non-residential side has a section that talks about, I think it's called height and yard, and it introduces the following sections regulate height and yard, and then the next section is height. So it's just a kind of a lot of text. So there's about 6 or 8 pages worth of text among all the zoning districts that are reflected in that one table. So the table in 1720.010 should be everything that's existing right now. There's no substantive changes to those building height setbacks or things like that. The biggest change would be with now what do we do with the design standards? So what we're titling the urban areas and commercial and mixed-use design standards. They're based on a similar theme of, again, relating buildings to the public realm. But those 4 points are key. What it allowed us to do was to expand what you're currently regulating in C2 with regard to design. We're regulating similar topics, but we're expanding the footprint of where you do it. But in doing so, we're also filtering that based on the street type. So an easy way to think of it would be everything in C2 is subject to those same design standards. But we know when we look at C2, there's a lot of different streets where you really want to hold tight on those design standards. There's others where it's maybe not as important to hold on those design standards. So the map that's in there should reflect that principle. It may not be 100% correct yet, but that's the theory that we're working on. And so the other option of expanding that area is it lets us eliminate the Burlington Corridor overlay, which has been a continual problem because of a lot of these issues as well. I guess the final bullet point there talks about the plan does talk about we want to improve commercial design everywhere. So throughout the city, anywhere a commercial district exists. So what we did there was we picked a default standard for those areas, and I'll walk through that here real quickly as well. So this is where it applies, everything that we've mapped out in that urban areas map, but then everywhere that's B1, B2, or B3, or I'm sorry, C, I got the wrong letter, C1, C2, and C3, right, your C districts, yeah. Generally, so if you're zoned one of those districts outside of this area, these technically would apply as well, and what we did was we set it at the default standard being at the walkable C frontage type, and I'll explain that here in a minute. But the topics on the left are what is regulated under the commercial design: building placement, facade design, and frontage design. And this is a closer look at the map and the street types, and we've gone through it in pretty good detail, but again, more eyes the better. The other thing I should say about this and all of the design standards, way back when we talked about one of the objectives of this code was more flexibility. When we're regulating for design, we always know that we're getting out on a limb. We're going to run into circumstances where we know a different design is appropriate, and we expect that to happen in this case as well. But instead of having those go to variances, each of these sections includes a design objective. In other words, here's what this design of standards is attempting to regulate. And then there's also intent statements throughout the code in a lot of the zoning districts. So through the site plan review process, there is the ability to give administrative adjustments. In other words, you haven't met the letter of the law, but you met the design objective or you met the intent. So we want to be able to approve those through a non-variance process, either at staff level or through a planning commission site plan review. So keep that in mind as you review both this map and the design standards themselves. So each of those colors is representing a frontage type, and for lack of a better way, think of them in terms of highest pedestrian amenity. In other words, Armour at the Armour and Swift intersection, to going down a bit to the orange, but down a bit further even the C, and that was the one where we kind of set that as the default as the citywide design standard for commercial and mixed-use development. And then the service streets, which are the more industrial streets. One of the key distinctions we were trying to make on those two streets was we've heard issues with regard to screening and outdoor storage and those types of things deeper in those areas, and there's some places that are getting hooked by a screening requirement where it's not necessarily important and no one really cares, and there's other places that don't have it where maybe we would have cared, and those didn't necessarily reflect zoning district boundaries, and so our thought was those really reflect street types, and so let's key the standards to that as well, and so we're still working through that. And then for the Burlington corridor, the green is really a hybrid of those approaches, so we couldn't really reconcile that there was any one frontage type that worked. So what we were suggesting is that there's a lenient standard on it, but as soon as there's a certain threshold of development, we do want to gradually start moving the buildings up to the street at significant reinvestment. So a little bit of a hybrid approach to that area. And then what do those standards have in them? So first, building placement. So that's the front building line. Where does the building sit in relation to the front lot line? And then what we call the required front building line. So what extent of the building is occupying that front building line. So the upper red graphic is showing the placement, and that could flex based on which type you are. And then the lower red graphic is showing how much of that lot are you occupying. And the idea there is on the higher pedestrian streets, we want it to be a lot more. On the lower level pedestrian streets or the service streets, we don't care as much, so that standard starts to go down, both in terms of where the building's placed and how much of that lot we care. An easy way to think about that is Armour, you want a full street wall because that activates the street and is very pedestrian friendly. On lesser streets, you don't care as much. The right hands kind of show the extremes of those sliding scales that the building placement standards are dealing with. The second major standard area is, okay, now we've got the building placed, what do we do with the facade? And there we're looking at the key elements of the urban design features. Again, a lot of this is coming from your current C2 standards. Is entry features, how prominent are they and how frequent are they? Highest pedestrian streets, a higher standard. Lower pedestrian streets, a less standard. On the service streets, maybe no standard at all, or just simply the fact that orient your building towards the front and you're good. Same thing on the transparency level. Highest pedestrian, we want a very visible street level. At the lowest level, you don't necessarily care at all, or in the intermediate, maybe it's just around the door. You want some transparency to give the building a human scale. So those standards are kind of sliding and calibrated as you move along there. And then lastly, the massing and modulation is the larger the wall planes, the more they would need to be broken up. And you care about that on Armour. You don't necessarily care about that deep in the industrial areas, and it could just be a large blank wall in most cases there in the deeper areas. And then the last standard is dealing with the leftover spaces, the access and parking requirements, and so a sliding scale on how much of the frontage could be occupied by that access, and then also the parking. This is one we're working on by looking at a lot of the current precedents, and we're going to be adjusting where the standards are because we know we're not quite on the mark yet. For example, the CVS or the First Watch building. We're looking at those to kind of adjust what you do with that parking along the street if you're on one of those A streets is important as well. And so we know there's some things to look at with our numbers on the frontage design aspect of it. And again, a lot of this comes from our observations of some of the existing patterns you have. So these are all pictures taken from our surveys of the area that sort of reflect some of the principles, and we think we have them about right, if not close enough to where they could get to a design review where you would be able to look at the intent and objectives and be able to make some good decisions based on that. The last two sections, first one, open space and landscape design. As I mentioned, open space is mainly just to kind of lend some a lens to that idea that not all open space is created equal. In the urban areas, we want smaller and more compact open spaces. In neighborhoods, maybe you want more spacious ones, so valuing those differently in different contexts. But the big change here is expanding on your current landscape standards. Right now, that section really just requires a landscape plan associated with a site plan review, and there's no real standards with it. So we set some plant requirements based on those components of a typical site: streetscape, frontage and foundation area, parking area, buffers, and then other leftover spaces.
We get asked for standards a lot. So this is something we're really excited to have in the ordinance. Right now, when people ask, we send them standards that we kind of made up based on Leawood's standards. So we're looking forward to having something that we can say, this is our actual standards. So it's not something that feels quite so ad hoc.
And then we also coordinate those standards with a lot of the frontage type design parameters that we had in the previous two sections. So there's an overlap there that they should nest in and be able to meet both requirements. Lastly, the access and parking standards. So these, again, basically reflect your current standards. We made some adjustments down in the required parking table where we thought maybe certain things were a little too high. We adjusted them down. I think there was only a few of those that we did because the other thing, you have a maximum now. I think that the one change we did there was in cases where someone is suggesting to go above the maximum, we do have some mitigating things that they can do to help with that. So I can't think of all of them off the top of my head, but things like increasing your plant requirement if you're going over the parking maximum. That idea of trying to get to the right number is really what we're getting at. But in cases where someone thinks the right number is a lot higher, you may ask them to do a few different things, whether it's offer some of the lot up for shared parking in certain cases, you increase their landscape buffer to mitigate the parking a little bit more, design it in a way that infiltrates stormwater. So all those things that are good things that we want to give credit for if you're going over the maximum amount of parking. From there, it was more adding flexibility and options to bring the number down for people that don't want to provide that much parking. So giving credits for on-street parking, allowing improving your shared parking requirement now, making it less of, I think currently it's a CUP, so putting that rate table in and just making it a by right allowance if you meet the certain conditions, and then credits for bike parking where it makes sense in relation to location to bike routes or bike amenities and things like that. And then just the last part was improving the landscape design in association with those landscape standards, setting the design standards based on the size and location of the lot. One of the problems we've noted with a lot of parking and landscape standard with cities is they have the effect of expanding the footprint of parking, and that's not always the intent. It's, you know, it's like we're trying to design the best parking lot possible. So for these smaller parking areas, we actually want little or no landscape standards on a lot of them because they're trying to fit as many spaces into a small spot. And if it's remote and well disguised, we really don't care about landscaping. It's only when they become a more prominent part of your site and building that we want the landscape standards to increase. So those standards are keyed towards the size of lot.
Just for general information, down there in the new development, and where the senior housing and everything else, is the parking adequate down there? Most of them all have their own garages and even the row homes, but, it looks like it's working. I
The
mean,
gardens?
yeah, mm-hmm.
We don't hear any complaints about the amount of parking that's available for the gardens, so it is at least adequate. I couldn't tell you how empty those lots are. We didn't include that in our parking
Right.
inventory. So they have at least as much as they need, if not more.
Well, I can probably chime in on that. I mean, we've got I think 1-to-1 was the ratio that was applied. So Gardens 4 is probably the best example of, you could see it being limited because there's obviously no street parking on two sides, which is unlike the other phases. I think so there's 60 units there, a lot of 2 bedrooms. Obviously it's seniors though, so not as many cars. There's always at least some empty.
Yeah.
And there's, I think, 61 spaces in that lot. So right at the minimum, and it's still extra. I know the big lot always has empty spaces, but I think that's why this is probably framed right, is what City View and the Gardens have going for it, and where we live on the other side of the street, is there's a lot of street parking.
Yeah.
So most of the people down there get as close as they can to their, the people who live on the first floor obviously sometimes go in their outdoor entrance. But I think it works well when you have a lot of street parking. So.
Yeah, and our goal with this is we want people to be able to say, okay, I know my business and I know which building I'm going into. How much parking do I need to provide so that we can try to get them to a point where those things are balanced, as opposed to us saying, here's how much parking you need to provide, and we don't care about any other details or nuance. I don't want us to be in a position where we are chasing businesses out of North Kansas City because they can't provide enough parking in a building. And I also don't want to be in a situation where we've got lots of empty parking. So we're trying to give people lots of ways to balance their needs and what we require. And we do a lot of CUPs about parking, which is a time and resource intensive for everybody. So if we can do that in a reasonable way that doesn't require coming to you and having a public hearing, then we also want to make that possible. So that you see more of the weird situations or the really hard situations or unusual situations instead of the everyday, I have a business and I want to share parking with the person next door.
I just wanted to know what you meant by credits for bike parking.
Yeah, so right now we have it set up that if you provide bike parking, you could get an automatic reduction in what your vehicle parking count would be. And then
At a certain rate.
Yeah, at a certain rate. And then in particular, if you have a use that draws a lot of bike traffic, or you're in close to one of the mapped bike routes, that would make a lot of sense. The other thing we did do is there is I believe we have a requirement for bike parking in there for certain uses as well. So some use, you're going to have to provide some in some cases.
Okay, I'm sorry. I somehow missed the email with the draft, so I'll have to go back and look for that.
So page 28-5 lists all of the things that you can reduce your parking requirement for. Like C2 is still exempt. If you're in C2, you're not providing any on-site parking. But you can reduce your parking requirement if there's on-street parking, for bicycle parking, if there's public parking within 600 feet, if you're sharing parking with someone else. So that can bring down the amount that you're required to provide on your own property. And we have a lot of calculations and credits available there.
Other than that, the remaining things, we know there will be a definition section in here, so that we reserve that to the end once we have all the words through. What we'll do is we'll cull through your existing definitions. Any words that are no longer used in this, we'll just throw those out. We'll look through to make sure they're still appropriate for the code and then put them in if so, and then we'll put in new definitions we need as we scan through, but we reserve that to final draft when we have all the wording finalized. And then there are some other sections that we know we need to work in to the formatting, and so that may mean another chapter on supplemental standards, things like your wireless telecommunication standards. We plan to roll those in and just reformat them and make them a little easier to use to the extent we can based on this ordinance format and structure. And there are a few things that we know we can update based on recent state laws and things like that. But other than that, we don't plan any major substantive changes for things like that unless we hear of problems. But there's special topics like that we know we need to work into as well. With that, and just open it up to any questions, thoughts, or points.
What is this?
Oh, we'll get to that. Staff comments.
No, don't hurry into it.
Yeah.
Any questions? No.
So what's the time period for submitting comments?
Good question. Good segue into.
Can we wait for next steps, and if there are any other comments, we absolutely want to talk about our next steps leading up to finalizing things.
Because I got to read. I got to tell you, I got a little way through this, and I went. So I've got to get back into it.
Imagine reading it more than once.
A lot of stuff in there.
And I don't know, should I mention the contents map? I can create a simplified one. To help you with that, what we do when we do this is I literally have like a table of contents in every subsection of your current regulations, and I have it mapped to where we put it in the new ones, or if it's a new section or not. And I could condense that down to just a rough table of contents. If there's certain things you're curious about from the old ordinance, you can kind of go, oh, that's going to be found in this section. And it can help you not feel like you have to read the whole thing, but I could easily provide that in the next couple of days if you all think that would be helpful.
I think in general, I haven't read through the whole thing yet either, but the high points, I think dealing with some other cities in the metro, this is where we want to go. You deal with a city like Overland Park that's overall very sophisticated, but their parking ordinance is from 1991, and that's just not reality. This is going to help North Kansas City, one, just clean it up. Clean up the language and the simplification, but also, it's one of those. It's like Chris said, we're not gonna regulate ourselves to the goals of the master plan overnight through regulation. But what this does is it opens it up. This changes the rules in a good way to make more things possible. With these smaller, I think you will start to see a lot more infill housing projects, smaller projects. Same with mixed use. You're starting to see it already, but I don't know. I like it. The parking change is a big deal. I think some of it's psychological. I think you should have to come in and ask for more, and there probably will be some legitimate requests for more. But overall, I think that's what you want to do. You want to share parking if you can. You want to, put that real estate to economic use, not just have it be a bunch of parking spaces. Why over park if you don't have to? So I think a lot of good changes.
I think the only thing that I still see on there, and I understand the challenges to it, is a way to possibly make it more walkable between the east and west side, specifically of I-29, specifically the one north to the rest of downtown North Kansas City. But I understand there's really
if nobody's ever had the opportunity to try to sprint across those on-ramps, if you walked from like here to say North Kansas State Hospital, it's like Frogger. It's really scary, but yeah.
That will always be a little bit of a challenge, but we'll do what we can. One of the things I did want to point out, because we did not discuss it a lot prior to these drafts, so one of the things that we're allowing by right is accessory dwelling units in all of our residential zoning districts, subject to certain criteria for the accessory dwelling unit. So I just want to make you all aware of that change, and so that if you are concerned about it, we can talk about it. If you're happy about it, we will know that. We have a lot of garages that have been converted to dwelling units already, primarily in our existing R4 zoning district. Some of them are really nice. But, you couldn't do that with every garage, but you could do it with some of them. And so we we just want you to be aware that that's one of the changes in the ordinance.
Great.
Any other questions or comments about this, or we can talk about next steps?
That's it. Thank you.
Okay. Well, no, let us talk about next steps before
next
you move on.
Oh,
Do you want me to jump in here?
Go ahead, yeah.
So, one of our next steps is to give you a little bit of extra time to finish reading through it and to give us any comments you have. We would really love it if you could do that in the next 2 weeks and provide any comments or questions, or just, I don't understand this section, or I don't see this, whatever it is. If you could give that to us by February 22nd. If you want, that's a Friday. If you want to email us, that's great. If you want to mark something up and drop it at the front counter with Mallory, that works. Whatever format you want to get that to us in, that's perfect. So 2 weeks from tomorrow is February 22nd. Our next step after that is to kind of assemble your comments and our final reviews into what we're going to call a public review draft. We will then take that out and do a couple of focus group meetings. So we are working on a list of people we'd like to invite to focus groups, people who are business owners, larger property owners, architects and engineers that we work with a lot, people who will have used our existing ordinance and be somewhat familiar with it and can give us some real technical feedback on the draft. We anticipate scheduling those meetings kind of around spring break in the month of March, and then having a public meeting the last week of March where we can say to anybody who might be interested, here's the draft, here's what it does, give us feedback. And then we'll be putting together a final review draft using that feedback and working on scheduling a joint City Council Planning Commission work session to review our final draft. We feel like we're pretty close to that final draft that then can go through the adoption process. But we want to make sure that we've caught everything we need to catch, that there's not a problem lurking in here that we just have overlooked, or there's not something like accessory dwelling units that people are going to say, that's just not right for North Kansas City. I hope it's not accessory dwelling units, but maybe there's something else in there that people are just not comfortable with. And so we think that we could be ready to adopt a new ordinance going through these next steps. Questions about that?
Yeah, you talked about bringing in some engineers and architects. That's the only thing I saw in like the height limits and some of those things. That, my opinion would be err on the side of, if you think it's 35 feet, make it 40. Just because you start talking about 10-foot ceilings, 2-foot trusses, and then you go, well, it doesn't take you very long. Like, our 2.5-story townhomes are looking at the third floor of the gardens. Well, you put the gardens that's only a 3-story building, which we know now we have a 4-story building, so it's not that tall. But then the roof truss is obviously, the bigger building you get, if you don't have flat roofs, you're just, so I would just say, rather than have a developer have to come back in and but ask for 5 feet or 8 feet on them. So I would just say, if you could, maybe err on the side of a little taller or wider.
Well then, if you have no other comments or questions, I would just reiterate February 22nd. Any feedback that you want to give us or if you want to say, hey, I think it looks awesome, we'll take that feedback too. But we would appreciate hearing that in the next couple of weeks.
Great, thanks, Sarah. And we'll move on to the discussion of the master plan.
Wow. Okay. So I'll keep this somewhat brief-ish. Believe it or not, this June will be 3 years since we adopted this master plan. So in the last 2.5-ish years, I feel like we've done a lot of work. This has taken up quite a bit of time and is a big part of implementing the master plan, is making sure that all of the development that's happening is moving us towards our goals. But there's other things we've done. The parking management plan was called for in the master plan. A lot of our corridor planning is coming out of master plan projects. we thought about this internally last June about, we really need to do some kind of status update to you all or something around where are we in implementation, and the summer just got away from us. And so we thought we'd introduce this topic a little earlier this year. We don't think we're coming up to the point of making amendments, but we do want to give you all a status update about these are the things we've done to implement the plan. These are the things that the plan specifically suggested that maybe we haven't gotten to yet. And we'd be interested in feedback about what form you would like that to take. Is this our meeting in June, we just go through the plan and talk about updates and what you all think about how we're implementing this? Is there a document you'd like us to prepare for you that we could make public? Any feedback you might have about what you'd like us to do coming up in June so that we've got plenty of time to prepare for that.
I understand the master plan is quite long, so I know that
it's not as long as it's some communities.
Right, but so I think it. Well, I know some of the folks on the commission weren't on the commission when we went through this process. I think that what might be good is to send out a copy of the master plan and give the commissioners a month, assuming we'll have a meeting next month, to review it and come next time with our thoughts on maybe what points might be most pertinent, at least, so you can maybe focus discussion on some items. Anybody else have any thoughts?
I think that would be a great opportunity. I would also like it if there's specific things that jump out as staff that you think we should know about, or that you're planning on doing that you haven't done yet, that kind of stuff. I would love for you to just like the highlights of your thoughts on the master plan, basically, just in case we all don't have time to read the master plan, which I assume is available online, right?
It is. Yeah. But we will still send you something to make it easier for you to get right to it.
I think some meeting time, though, to just do a general review with everybody here would be, that's really good. We can kind of do some groundwork so we're ready for that meeting. But I think just an overall review would be great.
So it sounds like we'll do that in June or sometime this summer.
I think we will plan to do it in June, but we will maybe do a little bit of preparatory work with you all leading up to that, so we can make sure that June is really useful for you all.
That'd be great. Do we have any comments from public? Nope. I guess we're going to get to this then, Sarah.
Yes, so we're going to do this. We have not done any targeted training with you all in a couple of years. We've gotten sidetracked by projects, and so it's been a while since we did anything just to help you all do a better job as planning commissioners. So we just thought we would poll you to see what topics you would be interested in getting some training on. So this is just my brainstormed list of things that might be of interest to you all. But in case there's something in your mind that is not on here, if you want to, you could rank your top choices. You could just put an X by the things that are of interest to you. But if you could just give us an idea of what you're interested in, then we can address that in future meetings through the course of the year. I will tell you that next month we plan to give you a primer about Sunshine Law from Mallory, because you all are subject to Sunshine Law, and so we want to make sure that you know what that means for you all. So Sunshine Law is not on here because it's not optional. We will talk about that in March. So
I have one question. What is tactical urbanism?
You can't carry a gun.
Tactical urbanism is small-scale pop-up projects that are focused on livening up an area and can take lots of different forms and can be done by a like a city, local government, or by people just kind of on their own.
It can be temporary or permanent.
It can be temporary or permanent.
Okay, cool.
So that's this. I also wanted to say Communities for All Ages is listed there. The City Council on Tuesday did approve a contract with Mark for us to continue to do Communities for All Ages work towards the silver and the gold level of recognition. We'll be working with a facilitator on that, and they've delegated some of that work to the Planning Commission. So sometime probably over the summer, we'll have a facilitator working with us on the work required to do that. A lot of it is just review of the things that we have in place and evaluating whether they are working for all ages. So I think we'll get a short update about that in our March meeting also. And then finally, about the March meeting, I understand that that's the night of the Snake Saturday Grand Marshal Ball. And so wanted to find out if we would not have a quorum that night, and if you all would want to move that meeting. We do need to have a March meeting. We will have before you all zoning text amendments about medical marijuana. We know we have do we have something out there? But we will definitely want to do that in March.
Well, what's quorum?
Quorum is 4.
I'm not going to the ball, I don't think. Who else is not going?
I'm out of town that first Thursday of March.
I'm out of town as well.
Okay, then we won't have quorum.
Okay.
So if you all have your calendars, do you want to go ahead and set a date now, or do you want us to poll you by email after tonight?
Let's just set a...
We would suggest moving it back a week to the next Thursday.
Sorry,
That would be the
14th.
14th, yet, yes?
Yeah, that'd be fine.
I mean,
Okay, well then we will. Oh, Mallory would also like to ask you all about July. The first Thursday in July is July 4th. City Hall will be closed. Would you like to move the July meeting back a week to July 11th?
That'd be fine, yeah.
Okay. We already have people asking about future calendars for future applications, so that will help us a lot. So for March, we'll plan to do a sunshine law overview, medical marijuana zoning text amendments. I would expect we might have a few people who will show up to comment in that public hearing, and I will probably give you just an overview on where we are with our focus groups as well. That's all I have for tonight.
Will you send us an email with all that?
Yes.
Thank you.
Great, well, thanks, everybody. And with that, I'll ask for a motion to adjourn.
Actually, before we do that, I just want to thank you guys again for stepping up. And welcome, Tim.
thank you very much.
Tim?
Thank you.
It gets easier.
Yeah, I guess we should have had on there welcoming our new member. Do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Tim Roberts. I have a business here in North Kansas City. I have a business that's been going on for 7 years. I build custom long-range rifles, a lot of law enforcement, military. That's about it. Yeah. Welcome.
Yeah, welcome, thanks. Now I'll ask for a motion to adjourn.
I move we adjourn.
And I'll second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
Great, thanks.
Oh, my gosh. I started to read that the other day. I thought, oh, man.
Really?
Pretty close. We might have done an hour and a half.
There's some meetings that are like 20 minutes.
Thank you.
Just bring your question.
Oh, that's okay.
It's the paradox.
Out there, but a moment later, she